Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 242, Theories in Research and Personality. Today we're going to go over the next to last chapter, the penultimate chapter, chapter 15. Today we're going to talk about the last approach in terms of its theories and application, and that is the cognitive approach. So we've talked about the behavioral approach already, and now let's spend some time talking about the cognitive approach. Now, in terms of your announcements, office hours are still available. Do remember if you haven't forgotten, if you haven't finished your Sona credits, please do so ASAP. Do need to get those done. But what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about a couple things, including the personal construct theory, what cognitive personality variables are, what it means to have a representation of who we are in terms of cognition. We'll use an applied theory of cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, sometimes called cognitive behavioral therapy, talking about how this can be used in therapy. We'll also talk in terms of assessment about the repertory grid technique, finishing off with strengths and criticisms of the cognitive approach. But let's go ahead and jump right in with what the cognitive approach is. And more or less, this is the idea that there are differences in personality, which we know, but they are due to differences in the way we process information. So if you think about, oftentimes you see this used in memory, actually. This model of memory, this is how we also process information, retrieve it from our long-term memory, put it into our short and long-term memory, things like this, right? And maybe it's differences in how this process works that give us differences in personality. Now, theoretically, this does come from Kurt Lewin, who was an early predecessor of this, but in reality, we don't necessarily associate the cognitive approach most strongly with Dr. Lewin. We associate it really strongly with George Kelly. And the premise of many approaches identified as cognitive come from this psychology of personal constructs. What's interesting, though, is George Kelly never thought of himself as a cognitive psychologist. He often wondered why this was even considered in the field of cognition. So, I mean, he made it somewhere I guess he wasn't too interested in making it in. But with the personal construct theory, this kind of theory of personal construct is this idea that we all have different cognitive structures. Oftentimes we think about these as like schemas, and they help us to predict and interpret events information, right, on some pretty bipolar scales, right? Is this person friendly or are they unfriendly? Are they intelligent? Are they not intelligent? Right? And more or less, oh, there's my picture, right? You and the way that you and I differentiate friendliness might be different. When I say friendly, I might expect somebody to kind of have kind of a more light voice and be very peppy when they talk to me. But you could be friendly and not have that pep to your step, and maybe you and I differ on something like that. And since we don't even organize our constructs in the same order as other people, maybe friendliness is very important for you, but maybe it's not that important for me. This causes more differences in the way that we see the world through these constructs. Now, the application of the first construct is followed by other bipolar constructs. So basically, when you meet someone, you are going to start off with an impression. And that might be, wow, this person's really loud, or I seem to like this person. And as soon as you do that, you start to follow that with other bipolar constructs, right, to determine the extent of, in this case, how black or white something is, or maybe, different shades of gray. So if the first thing you see somebody do is, smile, shake your hand, and say it's nice to meet you, you might think, okay, so this person's pretty friendly. But then you see them turn to somebody else and scream at them. Well, now you're starting to determine how much you agree and disagree with, are they completely friendly? Are they mostly friendly? And these differences in personality of ourselves come from the differences in the ways that we construe the world or how we make sense of the world. So the initial thoughts of people basically, we look at our initial thoughts of people, and then we use that to make sense of others and their behavior. So going through this kind of thought to behavior route, and also recognizing that individuals may use these same constructs and construe the world differently, depending on maybe order, depending on how they define these constructs. So more or less, right, how we understand who people are comes from how we choose to focus on the world, what we decide to focus on, and not only that, what order we decide to focus on them, how we define those things we're focusing on, because your definition of friendly and my definition of friendly might be different. Your definition of intelligent, my definition of intelligent might be different. And your opposite of intelligent might be different than what I consider the opposite. Just in the same way, if I ask you what the opposite of green is, some of you might say, what the opposite of, red is, some of you might say blue, and some of you might say green, depending on how you are determining the opposite. Are you thinking about this in terms of like streetlights, or are you thinking about this in terms of like art? So there's a way that we might see our constructs differ. So this is kind of, to me, hard to explain without you having the context of reading the book. So I encourage you, if you're still struggling with this, going back through the book, as these are very abstract, which is something we'll talk about in terms of a weakness of this. But with our inadequate personal constructs, the idea here is that mental health issues, right, or psychological problems come about due to problems or deficits in how we look at the construct of the world. So, right, if we have past traumatic experiences, the cognitive approach says that's not really the cause of the problem, because it could be something else. And what do we mean by that? Well, we know that people become anxious when personal constructs fail to make sense of the events in their lives, right? If something doesn't seem to go right, you might feel very strange, because things don't seem normal to you, right? If you lose a schema, or a schema isn't followed the right way. Additionally, people frequently generate a new construct to replace an inadequate one. So if right, like my definition of trees, right, for instance, mostly looked a lot like pine trees, or right, trees with some pretty big leaves, but you could think that my construct of trees has probably changed a little bit more given the fact that I live surrounded by palm trees now. While it's not something I had to newly incorporate, it's taking up a bigger amount of this personal construct. But we can understand that it could be an issue, that is, psychological problems could be an issue with, right, this validation or confirmation of an anticipation. Part of what we mean by that is more or less, say that you're very nervous around dogs or something, you're very anxious and afraid, you might actively avoid situations with dogs, and maybe not be able to update your schema to recognize that not all dogs are terrible. But again, I think the book does a much better job explaining this than me, even after reading it a few times. But moving on to cognitive and personality variables, these are what they describe as elements between the stimulus and the response. So what is going on in the black box of your brain, right? Which more or less we can't tell very easily what is going on, but what is going on up there is what is causing us individual differences, right? If somebody says, "Hi, how are you?" to each one of us, we might not say the exact same thing. We might not all respond the same way, but we all had the same input, right? We all had the same stimulus, but how do we work with those? Well, these are referred to as cognitive affective units, so cognitive and affective emotional, and it's all part of a complex system that links situations people encounter with their behavior, right? So situation happens, something happens in the brain, and the outcome. This is a very complex model for a specific study, but understanding But these can get pretty detailed pretty fast in terms of what they look like. And right, this is a complex system to understand how our thoughts, our emotions, and everything else, right, cognitions that are going on up there affect us. And so these individual differences in our cognitive frameworks, right, so our understanding of, right, you and I might think of right here chairs as the same thing, tables as the same thing, but maybe you think of a closet as a wardrobe, and I think of it as a room style closet, right? This is an individual difference in a cognitive framework. And this is due to, right, different representations we have. Maybe you've only seen closets. I used to live somewhere without a closet, so we had to use a wardrobe like that, but I never considered it a closet. Somebody else might feel that way, though, right? So these individual differences in cognitive frameworks may be due to these differences in mental representations between people, right? Your representations might be different than mine, but also how we represent another person. You and I probably represent who I am very differently, for instance, individuals differ in the manner they access stored information as well, so how they retrieve it. And we know that people react to the same situation differently, right? So if I say, hey, how's it going? You're going to respond differently than the person behind you, if we're doing this in line, I guess. But there's a lot of, when we talk about cognitive personality variables, right, we're talking about different types of encoding or different understanding that information about our lives, our expectations for what we think is going to happen, right, our emotions, our goals, our values, what we know we're good at, what we think we can do. And all of these things, right, are a very complex web that's going on inside our head that leads to some decision that leads to a behavior. So again, this is a theory that suggests a lot is going on up in our heads, which is probably correct, but it's also very difficult to really drill down on what that means because we can't operate on a person finding this out while they're alive. But another thing, and one of the most important cognitive representations we have, most important schemas we have, is a cognizant understanding of the self. So knowing who we are. This mental representation, we know are unique to individuals. We know that specifically we all have a self-concept. After about 18 to 24 months of age, about 2 years old, children are able to have a self-concept, a cognitive representation of who they are, right? So this might include things like your goals, your social life, your values, your beliefs, your abilities. We can think about this in terms of other things like who we were in the past, who we are now, who we want to be, different self-schemas we'll talk about in a minute. This tends to be relatively stable over time, and it plays a central role in the way people process information. So what do I mean by that? Well, we at the heart of it are somewhat selfish creatures. The cognitive representations that we use to understand who we are based on self-relevant information. So I know certain things about me that are relevant to who I am. And the funny thing is, right, this is going to be mostly focused on this idea of behaviors and attitudes. And when you look at this, right, this might make a little bit of sense to you, right? So an example I found online would say that somebody's self-schema and who they are is mostly related to things like being creative, honest, a daughter, religious, and a student. But it also includes things, right, like being intelligent, insecure, person's a singer, is kind. And you can see some of these are a little less strong as they're less close to the self. But similarly, these are self-schemas or self-understandings. So these are full of trait concepts, right? So all of these things back here, honest, dependable, nice, singer, etc., are going to be trait concepts. People believe or behave differently due to the individual differences in self-schemas. If you think you're nice, you might be behaving differently than if you, right, a trait concept of yours was that you were mean. And this framework for understanding who we are is really based on this self-reference effect. The idea that we look for information that helps us to understand who we are, and we know that information that helps us to know that is actually better stuck in our brains. So we easily remember self-referent words as they're processed through self-schemas. We easily remember self-referent dates, objects, jobs, things like this. So think about it this way. If you are asked to remember somebody's birthday and it is like 3 months after yours, right? Say your birthday's in July and this is a birthday in like October. You're probably not going to remember it really well. But if I told you to remember a birthday and it just happened to be 2 or 3 days away from your birthday, you're going to be a lot more likely to remember it, right? Because it's a lot more similar to you. And that's just one example. And what we know is when we ask people to just look at these words and determine if they are or are not words, what we see people do is they actually tend to find these independent and dependent adjectives, depending on if a person's independent or dependent. They can find them faster. So for instance, this can be kind of confusing. If you have a lower latency, this means you remember or you're able to pull these things out quicker and answer quicker. So this is going to be faster timings and meaning that these are more tightly linked in memory. So words judged as self-descriptive, we know that for the dependent people looking at words that reminded them of being dependent, they were able to recognize these pretty fast compared to dependent people reading independent words. The reverse results can kind of be seen here, which is interesting because we're looking for words not judged as self-descriptive. And additionally, in another study, they just asked people to tell if these words were words or not, or what words they were looking at. Did they have big letters? Did they rhyme with this other word? Did they mean the same thing as another word? Or lastly, did they describe you? What they found was that in a surprise memory test after this, people were much more likely to remember words that were describing them. Because, again, this is very self-referential. It's very similar to the just understanding of oneself. So you're going to remember that information better. On top of that, it's also important to recognize the idea of possible selves. Right? Possible selves are these cognitive representations of the kind of person we might become someday, who we might end up being. And that's very important because who we think we are and who we think we're going to be kind of determines who we or what we should do. And this provides us incentives for future behavior in order to get there, and helps us to interpret the meaning of behavior events in our lives. A very complex model down here, if you'd like to say, kind of look what this looks like. But for instance, if I thought I wasn't very good at school and I did bad on an exam, I might interpret the meaning of that behavior as, well, I probably shouldn't go to college, or I shouldn't try very much in school because I'm not smart. And you can imagine how that representation of yourself as somebody who's not smart definitely is going to impact your life trajectory, even starting at this simple behavioral level. So what's interesting about possible selves is that researchers use this to study varied behaviors. So do you, looking at things like binge drinking, academic performance, weight loss, adherence to an exercise goal, and more or less, we can look at how close you are to these other selves versus how much you might want to be like these other selves. So if you're not like a binge drinking person and you don't want to be like a binge drinking person, that's pretty good. But thinking about where we are, where we want to be, and where we could be is also very important. Similarly, research actually has found that women tend to remember more relational versus relational information, given that it's more similar to their possible self. On the other hand, men tend to remember more performance-focused versions of them possible selves, suggesting that there is some aspect of culture being built into this as well. So when we look at the application of this kind of thought process, what we see is that using cognitive and cognitive behavior psychotherapy, it's really based on this idea of having people look at the thoughts that they're making and determining if they're rational or real or appropriate. And oftentimes by doing that, we can recognize maybe we're telling ourselves inappropriate or untrue thoughts and replace them with thoughts that are a little bit more appropriate. So cognitive psychologists teach clients how to deal with the future and recurring problems. So this original model technically used the word beliefs, or in this kind of idea of a self-schema. But more or less, the idea was that these beliefs about ourselves, which can be changed, influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all influence one another as well. However, this is limited to psychological problems that are based on irrational and self-defeating thinking. So things like depression and anxiety are very good for this. Now, if you're having a psychotic break, this therapy isn't going to be too useful because this is not something that really is looking to treat those kind of behaviors. With the rational emotive therapy developed by Albert Ellis, more or less going back to the idea that depression, anxiety, and all of this is based on irrational beliefs. And how we can look at this is through an ABC, now actually an ABCD process, where we look at an activating experience to cause this irrational belief. Then we look at that irrational belief itself, and we see how that affects somebody's emotional state afterwards, what kind of emotional consequences that thought or belief has. So the goal of this therapy is to see those irrational beliefs, be able to say, hey, that's not true. Let me kind of explain why that's not true to myself so I can move on. So imagining, wow, I didn't do so well on that test. I must be an idiot. Being able to say to yourself, no, actually, maybe it was a more tough test. Maybe you just didn't study enough, but it's okay to not do great on every exam, right? And replace that irrational belief with a more rational one. So something here that might kind of make sense to you. This example here, more or less, we see an activating event. Somebody asked somebody out. They said no. This caused this belief, this irrational belief that they're never going to find love, which causes these consequences that I'm hopeless and depressed, which is going to continue to circle back and forth between this, I'm depressed, I don't want to do anything, and now I'm never going to find love, which is going to keep me in this negative cycle. But what you can do is you can break this cycle by disputing these irrational beliefs and hopefully being able to continue to dispute those if they do come back up, and getting you out of this chain. So hopefully the idea here is using certain irrational thoughts, using the ability to catch you making those certain irrational thoughts or irrational beliefs. So some obvious irrational beliefs are, they go through a couple examples here. I don't want to spend too much time talking about these obvious ones, but makes sense why these are pretty irrational. Some subtle or more tricky irrational beliefs, because I strongly desire to perform important tasks competently and successfully, and because I want to succeed at them only some of the time, I absolutely must perform these tasks well, This is almost like, if I'm not perfect, I'm terrible, Everybody wants to do important tasks right, and because I want to succeed at them only some of the time, sorry about that. I caught a couple errors in the wording there that was throwing me off. So I went ahead and made those changes. So to restart that last thing I just said, because I strongly desire to perform important tasks competently and successfully, which we all do, and because I succeed at them only some of the time, we're not always great at everything we do, I absolutely must perform these tasks well. More or less considering, maybe I might get fired or lose my job or not get a good grade if I don't do that well. And recognizing that, it's good to try to do them well, but that absolutely might be putting a lot of pressure on yourself with that, right? Absolutely must perform them well. Additionally, this idea that, right, because I strongly desire to be approved by people I find significant, and because I only want a little approval from them, I must absolutely have it. You can try to get approval from anyone you want, but you're not guaranteed to get it. People don't have to give you their approval, and that might be tough for some people who really crave approval from other people, who just aren't going to get it. Some other ones, I like this one. I think that people should treat me fairly, and I'm almost always fair to other people, so everyone should treat me well. I mean, that's not a really fair thing to think when we put it more that way. And this last one, because I strongly desire to have a safe, comfortable, and satisfying life, which I want to stop right there and say we all probably do. And because I'm a nice person who tries to help others, which we all kind of think we are, the conditions under which I live must be easy, convenient, and gratifying. I would love to live under conditions that are easy, convenient, and gratifying, but that's right, not the way the world works. The world can be very unfair. So maybe this is also another belief that isn't true. Now, how can we actually look at this? Well, we can look at the repertory grid technique, oftentimes also called the role construct repertory test, or often the rep test. This is a common version developed by George Kelly and his followers. And more or less what you can see here is how they describe how it works in the book. You've got two poles. You've got construct with the emergent and the contrast poles on the left and right side of this. And underneath you have, right, different contrasts. So, right, how about older? Let's look at a good one. So if you were thinking about what kind of people are, right, is this, right, the one end of this could be, I'm just an average likable person. On the other end of that, the opposite of an average likable person, apparently to this person, is a loner or a shy or a sly person. I like how they go from sly/untrustworthy to ordinary and likable again. And these are very different than how we said things like friendly and unfriendly, but these are the constructs that this individual is choosing to make. Additionally, we have different elements in here who are actually people from this person's life, and we are determining if they are more, right, construct version A or construct version B. Are they more sly or are they more ordinary? Are they less mature? Are they less young? Which one? And so the procedure, as we said, is the test taker creates a list of elements, which usually are people that person knows. And then we just use personal constructs that are elicited by comparing various elements on the list. So the second step of the procedure creates this grid, which allows the therapist and client to look for patterns across the broad set of behavior. So if we're comparing, right, being pleasant versus unpleasant, we're comparing these people to say, let's say ourselves, actually. We would say, apparently, mom is more pleasant, same with friend, but everybody else is more unpleasant than me. Well, that gives us a good idea where you might stand, and maybe we can check there for any cognitive distortions. And I think this is a really useful thing. Researchers use this technique to study right, how effective people are at teaching, how to profile specific criminal types, looking at what kind of things people might want to do with their life in terms of career counseling. However, this is a very complex test. Right, this is about almost like kind of over-under about all different types of people and all different traits or, kind of ideas in terms of these polarity ideas. And there's several assumptions underlying the test. One, which isn't even here, is that you are having reasonable understandings of these people. Maybe you have a cognitive distortion that thinks, right, my mom is this terrible person and she hates me, and maybe that's not true. But two, the constructs that you're talking about here have some degree of permanence. So you want to look for things that are typically pretty permanent, not just kind of, we would call them like secondary traits or things that might change more often. Really kind of hard and hardy traits, I guess is the word that are going to stick around. So the last thing to talk about are the strengths and criticisms of the cognitive approach. And this approach is really good because this was developed through empirical findings. This was kind of our purely empirical approach to psychology and doing some personality understanding of personality. It's been subjective to extensive investigation in controlled laboratory experiments, as well as kind of out in the world, and it fits well with what we understand of psychology at the current moment. And we know that therapists from other approaches really do tend to use this approach and humanistic. Both of those approaches seem to always, no matter what you do, you get some approach or some elements of an approach from these two. In terms of the criticisms, this is really abstract. As we've said, it's hard to describe, it's hard to really understand unless we put it into specific patients and kind of get it through examples that way. It's tough to introduce specific cognitive concepts to account for individual differences in behavior. How can we know if a specific type of thought or action is going to actually change this? And recognizing that while many of these other approaches came from kind of grand theories that were theorized, this one came from scientific findings, but there's no specific model or grand overarching theory to guide this research. With that, I know this was pretty short. Hopefully it all made sense. If not, I'm happy to take questions at office hours or just shoot me an email. Don't forget about your Sona credits. If you have any questions, though, let me know. Otherwise, we're almost there. Have a good one, and I will see you all soon.